The check came by courier, not by mail, and that should have told me something right there. I was standing in the driveway with a socket wrench still in my hand, grease under 3 of my fingernails, when the young man in the polo shirt asked me to sign for an envelope. Cream-colored, heavy stock, my name written in a hand I didn't recognize, though the return address made my stomach drop before I'd even opened it. Ashford Kane Events, Houston, Texas. Inside was a cashier's check for $12,000 and a single folded sheet of paper that read, "Dad, please don't come to the wedding. It's better this way. For everyone. I'm sorry. M." I stood there in the July heat with the paper in one hand and the check in the other, and for a second I honestly could not make my eyes focus on the numbers. Not because the number was so large, because the person who supposedly wrote it had called me every single Sunday at 6 o'clock for 11 years straight, sitting on the tailgate of her truck, no matter where she was in the world, just to tell me about her week. I had absolutely no idea what was about to happen next. Neither did she. And in 6 days, the man marrying my daughter would be standing in my driveway too, except he'd be the one crying. My name is Walter Grissom. I'm 63 years old, and I live on 12 acres about 40 minutes north of Houston, off a county road that still floods every spring no matter how many times the state promises to fix the culvert. I've lived on this land for 31 years. I built the house with my own hands, room by room, starting with a single wide trailer and a poured slab, finishing with the wraparound porch my wife Carol asked for every year until I finally gave it to her the summer before she got sick. I was an electrician for 38 years, union licensed. The kind of work where your knees start telling on you around 50, and your hands never quite lose the calluses, no matter how much lotion your daughter buys you for Christmas. I wired half the strip malls between Conroe and the Woodlands at some point in my career, climbed more attics in August heat than I care to count, and retired 4 years ago with a pension, a paid-off truck, and hands that still shake slightly on cold mornings from 30-some years of vibration tools. Carol and I raised Emily together until Emily was 17. Then Carol got a diagnosis nobody wants to hear twice, and 18 months later I was raising a teenage girl by myself in a house that still smelled like her mother's shampoo for longer than I ever admitted to anyone. I worked overtime for 2 years straight to keep Emily in the private school Carol had wanted for her, drove 40 extra minutes each way so she wouldn't have to change schools in the middle of her junior year, and learned how to do a French braid from a YouTube video at 11 o'clock at night because there was nobody else in the house to do it. I tell you all that not because I think it makes me a saint. Plenty of fathers do exactly what needs doing without anybody handing them a medal for it. I tell you that because you need to understand what 19 years of being somebody's whole world does to a person, and what it does when that gets taken away with a cashier's check and 4 sentences on a piece of paper. My own father left when I was 12 years old, walked out on a Tuesday, took the good truck, left my mother with 3 kids and a stack of unpaid bills, and I did not see him again until I was 34 and he was dying in a VA hospital in San Antonio, wanting to make things right in the last 6 weeks of his life after ignoring the previous 22 years. I went. I sat with him. I forgave him mostly, because carrying that kind of weight forever seemed like its own kind of punishment. But I promised myself, sitting in that hospital room smelling the bleach and the decay underneath it, that I would never, ever be the reason my own child felt disposable. I think about my mother a lot when I think about that promise, too. She raised 3 of us alone on a school cafeteria salary, and whatever child support check showed up, which wasn't often and wasn't much when it did. She never once badmouthed my father to us, not directly. Not even on the nights I know she cried in the bathroom with the fan running, so we wouldn't hear it. She used to say, folding laundry at the kitchen table at 10 at night, "Bitterness is a bill you pay every day for a debt somebody else stopped acknowledging a long time ago. I'm not paying it." I didn't understand what she meant until I was much older. I understood it completely, sitting on my tailgate with that letter in my hand. Carol and I built our life the slow way. We met at a church function neither of us particularly wanted to attend, both of us there because our mothers had insisted, and we spent the whole 2 hours making quiet jokes about the potato salad instead of listening to the sermon on fellowship. We got married 11 months later in her parents' backyard in Willis, Texas, with 60 folding chairs, and a cake her aunt baked that leaned about 4 degrees to the left the whole reception. We didn't have money for a honeymoon, so we drove to Galveston for 2 nights and called it even. For the first 6 years of our marriage, we rented a 2-bedroom house that flooded every time it rained more than an inch, and we saved every spare dollar toward the 12 acres north of Conroe that a retiring dairy farmer was selling off in pieces. I remember the day we signed the papers on this land. Carol cried, standing in the middle of an overgrown pasture with fire ants swarming around her sandals, and she said it was the first piece of ground either of us had ever owned outright in our whole lives, and she wanted to be buried on it someday if we could ever manage that. We couldn't, in the end, county rules being what they are, but she's close, in a cemetery about 2 miles down the road, close enough that I can walk there on a cool morning if I want to, and some mornings I do. Emily was born 4 years after we bought the land. In the same year, I finished the main house well enough to move us in off the trailer pad. Carol used to joke that Emily and the house were raised together, both of them a little rough around the edges those first few years, both of them turning out better than either of us had any right to expect. I was gone a lot during Emily's early childhood, working the kind of overtime that pays a mortgage but costs you dinner most nights, and Carol carried more of the actual raising in those years than I did, something I've never fully forgiven myself, for even though Carol herself never once held it against me. When Carol got sick, Emily was 17, old enough to understand exactly what the doctors were saying, and young enough that no part of her was equipped to carry it. I watched my daughter grow up about 6 years in the span of 18 months, learning to manage a household's grief, while also trying to finish high school geometry homework at the kitchen table some nights, with her mother's oxygen concentrator humming in the next room. After Carol passed, it was just the 2 of us in a house that still had Carol's reading glasses sitting on the nightstand for almost a year because neither of us could bring ourselves to move them. Those years are why the Sunday calls mattered so much to me. They weren't just a nice habit. They were proof, every single week, that whatever we'd built together in that hard stretch after Carol died had actually held. That proof is what I felt slipping out from under me the day that courier's truck pulled into my driveway. So when I say that letter hit different than it might have hit somebody else, I need you to understand exactly how different. Emily used to leave sticky notes on my truck dashboard before she left for college. Not sappy ones, just little things like "Drive safe, old man," or a badly drawn picture of the 2 of us. I kept every single one of them in the glove box for 4 years. That's the kind of relationship we had. Not perfect. We fought about her choice of major freshman year, about a boyfriend I didn't trust her sophomore year, about the fact that she moved to Houston instead of staying closer to home after graduation. But every single Sunday at 6 o'clock, rain or shine, good week or bad, the phone rang and it was Emily, sitting somewhere with her feet up, telling me about her life like I was still the first person she wanted to tell it to. That's the relationship the letter was asking me to set fire to. For $12,000. Emily met Daniel Ashford Kane a little over 2 years ago at a conference in Dallas. I remember exactly when she told me about him, because it was a Sunday call, obviously, and she was more nervous talking about a boy than I'd heard her since high school. His family, it turned out, was Houston old money, not flashy old money, the kind that doesn't need to be flashy because everyone in a 50-mile radius already knows exactly who they are. His father built a chain of energy services companies in the 80s and 90s. His mother, Vivian Ashford Kane, sat on 3 different charity boards, had her photograph in the society pages of the Houston Chronicle often enough that I recognized her face before I ever shook her hand, and ran her household, by every account I gathered later, like a small, extremely well-dressed corporation. The first time I met Vivian, she could not have been more gracious. I want to be completely honest about that, because it matters for what comes later. She hosted a Meet the Family dinner at her home in River Oaks, a house so large I genuinely got turned around looking for the bathroom, and she greeted me at the door with both hands wrapped around mine like I was an old friend she'd been waiting all year to see. She complimented my boots, actual leather work boots, the only dress shoes I own that don't pinch, and said something about how she loved a man who looked like he'd actually built something with his hands, unlike half the men at her club luncheons. She poured me a glass of wine I couldn't pronounce the name of and asked me real questions about Carol, about the house, about Emily's childhood, and she listened like she meant it. If you'd asked me that night what I thought of Vivian Ashford Kane, I would have told you she was warm, sharp, generous, and exactly the kind of mother-in-law any father would feel relieved to hand his daughter off to. But there were two things that first night that I noticed, and then talked myself out of noticing. The way you do when you want very badly for something to be fine. The first was small. At one point, while I was telling a story about rewiring a substation panel during a storm, Vivian's eyes moved, just for a second, just barely, down to my hands and back up to my face, and there was something in that half-second glance that felt less like admiration and more like an inventory being taken, like she was quietly calculating something and filing the answer away for later use. The second was a comment, tossed off so lightly I almost missed it entirely. Talking about the wedding, still 18 months out at that point, she said, "Of course, the guest list is going to have to reflect who we're becoming as a family, not just who we've been." She smiled when she said it. Everyone at the table nodded along like it was nothing. I told myself it was just wedding planning talk, the kind of thing rich people say about seating charts and champagne budgets. I would think about that sentence a great deal later. There was a third thing, too, smaller still, that I only fully understood in hindsight. Toward the end of that first dinner, Vivian's phone buzzed face down on the table, and instead of glancing at it the way most people do out of pure reflex, she placed one manicured hand flat over the top of it, deliberately, without breaking eye contact with whoever she was speaking to, and let it buzz itself out underneath her palm. I noticed the gesture because it struck me as oddly practiced, the kind of small physical habit a person only develops after years of needing to control exactly what other people see and when they see it. I filed it away without a name for what it meant. I would understand it better later, once I'd read enough of her private messages to know how much of her life ran on things other people weren't supposed to see until she'd decided the timing was right. Over the following year, the signals kept coming, small enough each time that I kept absorbing them the way you absorb 100 tiny cuts before you notice you're bleeding. Vivian mentioned, more than once, that the wedding would be photographed for a Houston lifestyle magazine, and each time she mentioned it, her eyes would flick toward me for half a second, like she was doing quiet math about what I would look like standing next to her in those photographs. She suggested gently that perhaps I might want to update my wardrobe a bit before the engagement party, framed as a generous offer. She'd have her personal shopper handle everything, no cost to me. She asked at one dinner whether I had considered speech coaching for the toast, since public speaking could be so nerve-wracking for people who aren't used to a microphone. Every one of these things, taken alone, could be explained away as simple thoughtfulness from a woman used to a certain kind of polish. I explained every single one of them away. That's what you do when the alternative is believing something painful about the mother of the man your daughter loves. The moment I could no longer explain away came 4 months before the wedding. At the final venue walkthrough, Vivian had prepared a seating chart, a beautiful, laminated, color-coded seating chart, the kind of thing that takes real time and real money to produce. And my name was not on it, not misplaced, not in the wrong seat, simply absent, as though the chart had been built around the assumption that I would not be present at my own daughter's wedding. When I pointed this out gently, trying not to make a scene in front of the venue coordinator, Vivian laughed, a light, musical laugh, the kind she'd clearly used 1,000 times to smooth over 1,000 awkward moments, and said, "Oh, Walter, that's just a placeholder chart. Don't read into it," and moved the conversation along before I could say another word. I let it go. I told Emily about it that Sunday, and Emily, my Emily, who used to leave sticky notes on my dashboard, laughed a little too and said, "Dad, it's probably nothing. Vivian's just intense about details. You know how she is." And because it was easier to believe my daughter than to trust the cold feeling that had settled behind my ribs, I let that go too. I remember hanging up that call and standing in my shop for a long moment afterward, a wrench still in my hand, feeling like I'd swallowed something that hadn't quite gone all the way down, though I couldn't have told you at the time exactly what it was. There was one more moment, about a month before the check arrived, that I didn't understand the full weight of until much later. Vivian had organized a small engagement photo session at the River Oaks house, and I'd driven in early to help carry a few folding chairs the photographer needed for an outdoor setup. While I was setting them up on the back lawn, I overheard Vivian on the phone, pacing near the pool house, clearly not realizing how far her voice carried across the water. "No, we're keeping it simple on his side," she was saying, in the tone of someone discussing a seating problem, not a person. "Just Emily and maybe the aunt. We'll handle the other situation separately. Before it becomes a whole conversation nobody needs to have in front of the photographer." I remember thinking, at the time, that she must have been talking about some difficult relative of Daniel's, some black sheep uncle nobody wanted at the wedding. It never once crossed my mind, standing there with a folding chair in each hand, that the other situation she was so carefully planning to handle away from any conversation was me. I want to tell you what the discovery actually looked like, because I've turned it over in my mind so many times since that every detail is burned into me the way a bad dream sometimes is, clearer than most of the good memories from that same year. It was a Tuesday, the second week of July, and I remember checking my watch when the courier's truck pulled into the driveway because I'd been in the middle of replacing a breaker in the shop, and I don't like leaving a panel open longer than I have to. The clock on the dash of the courier's truck, visible through the windshield, read 2:17 in the afternoon. I remember that specifically because I looked at it twice, first out of habit and second because some part of me already knew I was about to need a fixed point to hang the rest of the day on. The envelope smelled faintly of the courier company's leather satchel, and underneath that, very faintly, of the same perfume Vivian had worn at that first dinner in River Oaks. That detail might mean nothing. It has stuck with me anyway. Inside, the cashier's check was drawn on a private bank I recognized because Daniel's family used it for everything. The kind of bank that doesn't advertise, that exists mainly to manage the money of people who don't want their money discussed in public. $12,000, made out to me, dated that same day. Clipped to the check with a single silver paperclip was the folded note, for sentences, signed with the nickname only Emily and her mother had ever used for her. M. The same nickname she'd signed every birthday card with since she was 7 years old. My hands went cold. In July, in East Texas, at 96 degrees, with the kind of humidity that makes your shirt stick to your back before you've walked 10 feet, my hands went ice cold, and they stayed that way for what felt like a very long time. Everything got slow after that. Not slow like time was actually moving slower, but slow like the volume on the entire world had been turned almost all the way down. I could hear the cicadas going in the trees behind the shop, the same relentless sound they make every July afternoon in Texas, but it sounded far away, like I was hearing it through a wall. I sat down on the tailgate of my truck, the same tailgate Emily used to sit on for our Sunday calls when she visited, and I read that note maybe 15 times. Like the words might rearrange themselves into something that made sense if I just looked at them long enough. Something settled into my chest that afternoon like furniture being moved into a room I never asked to have furnished. Heavy, permanent feeling. Not sadness exactly, not yet. Something more like the sensation of a floor you trusted your whole life quietly, silently, giving way beneath you one board at a time. I walked into the house at some point, though I don't remember deciding to. I remember standing in the kitchen, looking at the calendar on the wall where Emily's wedding date was circled in red marker, a circle I'd drawn myself back in January with more excitement than I'd felt about anything in years. I remember the refrigerator humming, the specific tick of the old wall clock Carol had bought at an estate sale decades ago, the smell of the coffee I'd made that morning gone cold and slightly bitter in the pot, all of it ordinary. All of it exactly the same as every other afternoon in that kitchen for 30 years, except that none of it felt the same at all. The way a familiar room looks foreign after you've learned bad news, standing inside it. I thought about calling Emily right then. Phone already halfway out of my pocket before I stopped myself. I pictured how the call would go. My voice cracking on the first question, hers going defensive before I'd even finished it. Both of us saying things neither of us could take back. I put the phone down on the counter instead and stood there a long while, hands braced against the edge of the sink, waiting for the cold feeling in them to pass. It didn't pass, not that day. It just moved, eventually, from my hands into somewhere deeper, somewhere that took a great deal longer to warm back up. I didn't call Emily that night. I want to be honest about that, because I think a lot of fathers in my position would have. I sat with it instead. I made myself a cup of coffee I didn't drink, and I sat on that porch Carol had wanted for so many years, and I watched the light go orange and then purple over the tree line, and I tried to figure out what kind of person my daughter had become, or what kind of pressure she must have been under, to write 4 sentences like that to the man who taught her to drive a stick shift in an empty church parking lot. I did not cash the check. 6 days later, 6 days I spent mostly working on the fence line and trying not to think too hard, though I thought about almost nothing else. A car I didn't recognize pulled into my driveway around 8 in the evening. A silver sedan, expensive. The kind of car that looks freshly detailed even when it's 3 years old. I watched from the porch as a young man got out, and it took me a second to place him because I'd only met him twice before, both times in a suit, both times with his mother somewhere nearby steering the conversation. Daniel, Emily's fiancé. Alone. He walked up to the porch steps slowly, like a man who wasn't entirely sure he was going to be allowed to finish the walk, and when he got close enough for the porch light to catch his face, I could see he'd been crying. Not a little. His eyes were red and swollen in a way that told me it hadn't just started in the car on the way over. "Mr. Grissom," he said, and his voice cracked on my own name. "I need to show you something, and I need you to know. Emily doesn't know I'm here. She doesn't know what I know. I need you to hear me out before you decide what to do with it." I didn't say anything at first. I just moved over on the porch swing, the way I would have for anybody who showed up at my house looking like that, and I waited. What Daniel told me over the next hour, sitting on that porch with the cicadas winding down and the first cool edge of evening finally cutting through the heat, rearranged everything I thought I understood about the last 4 months. He had found out, almost by accident, that his mother had been managing far more of the wedding, and far more of Emily's decisions leading up to it, than either he or Emily had realized. He'd gone looking for a florist invoice in his mother's email a few days earlier, needing it for his own records, and had stumbled instead on a thread of messages between Vivian and the wedding planner. And then, following the thread further, because something about the tone had bothered him, a second thread between Vivian and Emily directly, messages Emily had apparently never mentioned to him, going back nearly 5 months. He had photographs of the messages on his phone. He asked if he could show me, and I said yes, because at that point I needed to know more than I needed to protect myself from knowing it. The first message from Vivian to the wedding planner read, "The father is a sweet man, but this is not the image we're building for the Chronicle spread. Steel-toe boots and a pickup truck don't belong in that story. We'll handle it separately from Emily's side of the planning." The second, sent to Emily 2 months later, was longer, and Daniel had to steady his hand to keep the phone from shaking as he showed it to me. Vivian had written, "I know this feels hard, sweetheart, but you have to think about what kind of life you're stepping into now. Daniel's world runs on appearances, whether that's fair or not. Your father is a good man, I'm sure, but he's not part of the story we're telling that day. Let me handle it quietly. 12,000 should more than cover whatever discomfort it causes him. And frankly, men like that understand money better than they understand feelings anyway. He'll take the check and move on. That's who he is. Men like that. That's who he is." I read those 2 phrases twice each, out loud, the way you sometimes need to hear a thing in your own voice before it becomes fully real. Men like that. He'll take the check and move on. $12,000, reduced to the exact price Vivian Ashford Kane believed it would cost to make a father disappear quietly from his only daughter's wedding day. Daniel told me, through what was left of his composure, that he had confronted his mother 2 nights before, after finding the messages, and she had not denied a word of it. She had simply said, with what he described as complete calm, "Someday you'll thank me for protecting the family's image, even if you don't understand it right now." He told me he had not slept properly since. He told me Emily believed, genuinely believed, as far as he could tell, that I had agreed to this arrangement willingly, that I had told Vivian directly I preferred to stay away and accept the money rather than make things awkward. He told me his mother had constructed, apparently over months, a version of events in which I was the one who wanted distance, framing every one of my calls and messages to Emily during that period as evidence of a man who kept trying to guilt-trip her after supposedly agreeing to stay away. I sat very still on that porch swing while he talked. I did not raise my voice. I did not stand up. I did not, though every instinct in my body wanted to, get in my truck and drive to River Oaks that same night to say something I would likely have regretted. I have never once in my life screamed at a person who wronged me, and I was not about to start with a 29-year-old kid who'd had the courage to drive out to a stranger's porch at 8 o'clock at night and cry in front of him rather than stay quiet. What I felt instead, underneath the cold and the anger, was something quieter and more dangerous, if I'm honest. A kind of stillness I recognized from 38 years of working with electricity, where the worst thing you can do the instant you realize a wire is live is panic. You breathe. You think. You find out exactly what you're dealing with before you touch anything else. Does Emily believe I asked for this? I asked him, and my voice came out steadier than I expected. She believes you told her mother. Told her directly, that you'd rather take the money and skip the awkwardness. Daniel said. I think Vivian showed her something. A voicemail, maybe, or texts. I don't know exactly what, but Emily's convinced it came from you. She's hurt, Mr. Grissom. She thinks you gave up on her, and it's breaking her heart. And she doesn't even know the real reason she's supposed to be hurt is a lie her own future mother-in-law built. That was the moment I decided what I was not going to do. I was not going to call Emily that night and unload 38 years of fatherly outrage onto a phone call. I was not going to drive to River Oaks and pound on Vivian Ashford-Kane's front door. I was not going to cash that check out of spite, or tear it up dramatically in front of Daniel to make a point. Any of those things would have felt good for approximately 4 minutes and would have handed Vivian exactly the story she needed. An unstable, embarrassing father proving, publicly, that he really did belong on the outside of the family photographs. Instead, I asked Daniel for copies of everything on his phone. Every message, every screenshot, every voicemail he could find. I asked him not to say anything to his mother about coming to see me, and I told him I needed a few days to think clearly before anybody did anything at all. He looked at me for a long moment before he left, and he said something I've thought about many times since. I don't know how you're this calm, he said. If it were my dad, I think he'd have already put a fist through something. Getting loud, I told him, just gives people a reason to stop listening to what you're actually saying. I've had a lot of years to learn that the hard way. After Daniel left, I sat alone on that porch until well past midnight. I want to tell you honestly that the feeling that came over me was not simple. There was anger, yes, plenty of it, sitting low and steady in my chest. But underneath the anger, there was something closer to grief. Grief for the version of Emily I thought I'd raised, the girl who left sticky notes on a dashboard, now apparently capable of believing her own father had traded her wedding for a check, without so much as a phone call to say goodbye. There was a strange, unwanted sadness for Vivian, too, if I'm being fully honest, a fleeting wondering about what kind of childhood teaches a person that love and image are the same currency, spendable and interchangeable. That thought didn't last long, but it was there, and I won't pretend it wasn't. The next morning, I called an old friend of mine, a man named Ray Delacroix, who spent 26 years as a Texas Department of Public Safety investigator before retiring to a small ranch about 20 minutes from mine. Ray and I had known each other since our sons were in Little League together, back when Ray still had a son, before a car accident took him at 19 and turned Ray into a quieter, harder-eyed version of himself for a while. Ray had a way of looking at a mess of facts and finding the one thread that actually mattered, and I needed exactly that. I laid it all out for him over coffee at his kitchen table. The check, the letter, the screenshots Daniel had sent me overnight, the seating chart from months before, all of it. Ray listened without interrupting, the way good investigators do, and when I finished, he sat back and was quiet for a long moment before he spoke. "Walter," he said, "she's not choosing them over you. Your daughter, I mean. She's been told a story about you, piece by piece, over months, by somebody who's very good at telling stories, and nobody's given her the ending yet. That's a different thing than choosing. Don't confuse the two. And don't let your hurt make you treat her like she made a choice she never actually got to make with real information." That single sentence did more to steady me than anything else in those first 2 weeks. It reframed the entire situation in a way I hadn't let myself consider. Not that my daughter had abandoned me, but that my daughter had been fed a version of me that wasn't true, carefully, over time, by someone whose interests were served by my absence. That distinction mattered enormously. It meant the fight, if there was going to be one, was not between Emily and me. It was between the truth and a very well-constructed lie. Ray helped me think through what to do with the evidence Daniel had given me. He suggested I have the screenshots forensically preserved rather than just kept on a phone, dated, backed up, and if possible authenticated in a way that would hold up if anyone ever tried to claim they'd been altered or taken out of context, which he warned me people like Vivian would absolutely try to claim. He suggested I keep the original letter and the uncashed check in a safe deposit box rather than at the house. He suggested, gently, that I write everything down myself while it was fresh, every date, every comment Vivian had made over the past year, every small signal I'd talked myself out of noticing, because memory fades and softens with time, and I would want the sharp version later, not the forgiving one. Over the following 3 weeks, I did exactly that, while doing my level best to keep living an ordinary life on the outside. I fixed the fence line I'd been putting off for 2 years. I mowed. I drove into town for parts one didn't strictly need, just to have somewhere to be. I visited Carol's grave twice, which I don't do often, and sat there longer than I meant to both times, telling her things out loud that I probably should have been saying to a person who could actually answer back. I made coffee every morning at the same time I always had, and some mornings I stood at the kitchen window with that coffee and felt the full weight of what I was carrying, and other mornings I felt almost nothing at all, just a strange, hollow calm, like the difference between the eye of a storm and the storm itself. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from performing normal while carrying something that isn't normal at all, and I don't think anyone fully understands it until they've lived through it themselves. I went to my regular Thursday breakfast with 3 other retired guys from the Union Hall, and I sat there for an hour and a half listening to Hutch complain about his knee replacement, and Dale brag about a base he'd caught the size of a car door, and I laughed in the right places and ordered my usual 2 eggs over easy, and not one of them had any idea that I was sitting there with a forged letter and an uncashed $12,000 check locked in a safe deposit box across town. Dale asked me, at one point, how the wedding planning was coming along, and I told him it was coming along fine, which was, at that exact moment, the largest lie I had told anyone in years. I kept working on the fence line most afternoons, not because it urgently needed doing, but because there is something about the rhythm of setting a post, tamping the dirt, checking it for plumb, that empties a man's head out in a way that sitting still never manages to do. Some afternoons I'd catch myself standing with a level in my hand, staring at nothing, replaying that message in my head. Men like that. He'll take the check and move on, until I noticed I'd been standing there so long the shadows had moved. Then I'd tamp the post and move to the next one, because the fence, at least, didn't lie to me about anything. Ray came by twice more during those 3 weeks, once with a legal pad full of notes organizing every date and message into a clean timeline, and once just to sit on the porch with me and not talk about any of it at all, which I think he understood I needed just as much as the timeline. On that second visit, he brought a 6-pack, and we watched the sun go down without saying much of anything for the better part of an hour. And right before he left, he said, "You know, Walter, some men in your position would have already burned the whole thing to the ground out of pure hurt. The fact that you didn't isn't weakness. That's the hardest kind of strength there is. And I've watched grown men with badges and guns fail to manage it under a lot less provocation than what you're sitting on." I had the screenshots forensically preserved through a friend of Ray's, who did digital evidence work for defense attorneys, a careful, quiet woman named Deb who confirmed, after running everything through her process, that none of the messages showed any signs of tampering or editing, a detail Ray insisted on getting locked down early, because he knew correctly that the first thing someone like Vivian would try once cornered was to claim the messages had been altered or taken out of context. I had the letter and the check both photographed under proper lighting, dated, and logged, then placed the originals in a safe deposit box at the bank in town, the plain kind of bank with a drive-through window and a calendar from a local feed store hanging behind the teller counter, about as far from Vivian's private bank as a place could be. I want to be honest about something else from those 3 weeks, because I think it matters. There were nights I did not sleep well, lying awake running through everything I might say if I ever got Vivian alone in a room, rehearsing sharper and crueler versions of the truth than the one I eventually delivered. I am not a saint, and I will not pretend those thoughts didn't come. But every morning, in the daylight, with a cup of coffee in my hand and the fence line waiting outside, I chose the quieter version instead, because I understood, somewhere underneath the hurt, that the version of me who showed up calm and simply set the truth down on the table would win something the angry version never could. Not just the argument, but my daughter's ability to trust her own judgment about me again, without any doubt left over about who had actually behaved badly. Daniel came by twice more during those weeks, each time bringing more documentation. It turned out the deception ran deeper than either of us initially realized. Vivian had not only misrepresented my supposed wishes to Emily, she had also, apparently, forged Emily's signature on an early venue deposit change order that quietly reduced the guest list's family of the bride, seating allocation from 12 to 4, months before the check was ever sent, laying the groundwork long before she ever put a number on the table. Daniel found this out from the wedding planner directly, a woman named Priscilla Boudreau, who, once Daniel started asking careful questions, admitted she'd had a bad feeling about the arrangement from the beginning, but had assumed, since Vivian was the one paying most of the wedding's considerable bills, that it wasn't her place to question the family's internal decisions. By the time the rehearsal dinner arrived, 6 days before the wedding itself, I had a folder, an actual physical folder, because Ray insisted paper doesn't crash and doesn't get subpoenaed out of existence, containing copies of every message, the forged change order, notarized statements from both Daniel and, eventually, from Priscilla Boudreau, and the original letter and uncashed checks sealed in a plastic sleeve. Ray had reviewed all of it twice. There was, by that point, simply no room left for Vivian Ashford Kane to claim any of it had been misunderstood. The rehearsal dinner was held at the Bayou Club, a private club in Houston with the kind of hushed, expensive quiet that comes from 100 years of people who never had to raise their voices to get what they wanted. Vivian had chosen it, of course, and I imagine she chose it in part because it was exactly the kind of room where she felt the most powerful. Soft lighting, deep carpet, waiters who anticipated a want before you'd finished forming the thought. I had not been invited to the rehearsal dinner. Daniel invited me himself, quietly, 3 days beforehand, telling his mother only that a few additional guests would be joining and letting her assume, apparently, that it referred to distant cousins on his side. He did not tell Emily either. He told me later that part of him was terrified I would walk in and everything would fall apart in the worst possible way, and part of him knew that if the truth was ever going to reach Emily intact, it needed to come from more than just his word against his mother's. I arrived at exactly 7:40, 10 minutes after the dinner had started, wearing the one good suit I own, the same one I'd worn to Carol's funeral, because some things in life call for your best clothes, whether or not anybody thinks you deserve to be wearing them. I carried the folder in my hand, not hidden, not flourished, just carried, the way you'd carry any paperwork you needed at a meeting. The room went quiet the way rooms do when something has shifted before anyone said a word out loud. Emily saw me first. I watched her face move through about 4 different expressions in the space of 2 seconds. Confusion, then something like hope, then confusion again, then a flicker of the guarded, hurt look I imagined she'd been wearing every time my name came up for the past several months. Vivian, seated at the head of the table in a pale blue dress that probably cost more than my truck, recovered her composure faster than anyone else in the room, which told me everything I needed to know about how many times in her life she'd had to perform calm in front of an audience. "Walter," she said, standing, smiling, every word smooth as poured concrete. "What a surprise. I'm afraid there's been some confusion about tonight's guest list." "There has been," I agreed, "but not the kind you're thinking of." I did not raise my voice. I want to be very clear about that, because I know some of you watching are waiting for the moment I finally let loose, and that moment never came. Not that night, and not since. I set the folder down on the edge of the table, next to Emily's water glass, close enough that she could see it, but not so close that it felt like I was throwing something at her. "Em," I said, and I used the nickname deliberately, gently, the same one that had been signed on the bottom of that letter that started all of this. "I need you to look at something before this goes any further. I'm not here to ruin your night. I'm here because I think you've been told a story about me, and you deserve to know it isn't true." Vivian's smile did not fully leave her face, but something behind her eyes went very still and very sharp. "This really isn't the time or the place," she said, and her voice had the faintest edge to it now, the first crack I'd seen since I walked in. "You forgot the change order in the venue file, Vivian," I said, still not raising my voice at all. "The one with Emily's signature on it, that Emily never actually signed. I'm sure your assistant can explain how that happened." I want to describe what happened over the next several minutes carefully, because I've watched it back in my memory more times than I can count, and each time I'm struck again by how quickly the whole architecture of a lie can come down once someone stops agreeing to hold it up. I opened the folder, and I did not hand over everything at once. I set down the copy of the letter first, next to the check, both sealed in their plastic sleeve, and I said simply, "This is what I got 6 days before this dinner," in case anyone's forgotten what it said. Emily's hand went to her mouth. She had clearly never seen the actual letter, only, I would learn moments later, been told its contents secondhand. Then I set down the printed screenshot of the message to the wedding planner. Men like that. Steel-toe boots don't belong in that story. I watched Emily read it, watched her face go through something I can only describe as the floor of her own understanding giving way, the exact feeling I'd had 6 days earlier on my own tailgate. Then last, I set down the message to Emily herself, the one Vivian had sent directly, the one instructing her to accept the version where I supposedly wanted the check, wanted the distance, wanted my own absence. He'll take the check and move on. That's who he is. I watched Emily's eyes move across that line twice, and I watched her look up at her fiancé's mother with an expression I hope I never have to see on my daughter's face again as long as I live. "Mom told me you said this," Emily said quietly to me, and her voice was shaking. She showed me a voicemail. She said it was you, saying you'd rather take the money than deal with the wedding stress. "I never made that call, Em," I said. "I never sent that letter. I never asked for that check. I sat on my porch for 6 days, trying to figure out what I did to make my own daughter believe I'd trade her wedding for $12,000. Vivian, to her credit, or perhaps simply to her practiced instinct, tried denial first, the way I imagined she'd talked her way out of 100 smaller messes over the years. "Those messages are being read completely out of context," she said, addressing the table now rather than just me, her voice rising slightly to command the room the way it must have commanded 1,000 board meetings. "Walter, I understand you're upset, but pulling private correspondence out of context in front of Emily's entire family the night before her wedding is frankly beneath. There's no context that changes. He'll take the check and move on. That's who he is." "Vivian," Daniel said, and this was the first time he'd spoken since I walked in. His voice cracked slightly, but he did not back down. "I found these on my own. Mr. Grissom didn't hack anything, didn't steal anything. I found them because I went looking for a florist invoice, and I found my own mother had been lying to the woman I'm marrying for 5 months straight." Vivian's composure shifted then, moving into the second stage the way I've since learned people like her almost always do once denial stops holding. She pivoted, hard, toward damage control. "Everything I did," she said, and her voice softened now, took on the wounded, reasonable tone of a woman being terribly misunderstood. "I did to protect this family's reputation during an extremely public wedding. I never meant to hurt anyone. If the money was insulting, Walter, I apologize, and we can absolutely revisit." "This was never about the money," I said, and for the first time all night, I felt something close to real heat behind my own words, though I kept my voice level. "It was never about a seating chart or a magazine spread either. It was about you deciding on your own, without ever once speaking to me directly, that I wasn't worth including in my daughter's life anymore, and then constructing a story good enough that she'd believe I agreed with you." Emily's father-in-law-to-be, Daniel's father, Richard Ashford Kane, a quiet man I'd only exchanged a handful of words with over the past 2 years, had been sitting silently through all of this, his face increasingly pale. He finally spoke, and his voice carried a weight in that room that even Vivian's practiced authority couldn't match. "Vivian," he said, "is this true? Did you forge Emily's signature on the venue paperwork?" The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, but it felt much longer. Vivian's eyes moved from her husband to Emily to me and back again, and I watched, in real time, the exact moment she understood that the room had already decided the answer before she'd said a word. Whatever she said next, the truth had already landed. "I was protecting this family," she said finally, quietly, the performance gone from her voice entirely for the first time that night. Someone had to make the hard decisions. Emily was too soft-hearted to see what needed to happen. And Walter, I'm sure he's a decent man, but he simply doesn't fit the picture of the life you're building, Daniel, and pretending otherwise doesn't change that. Richard set down his water glass very carefully, the way a man does when he's trying not to let his hand shake in front of a room full of people. 26 years, he said, mostly to himself, though everyone at the table heard it. 26 years I've watched you manage every room we've ever walked into, and I told myself that was just who you were, that it didn't cost anybody anything. I didn't understand until right now that it's always cost somebody something. I just never happened to be standing where the bill landed before. Vivian's eyes flicked toward her husband, and for just a moment, something genuinely uncertain crossed her face. Not performance, not strategy, just a woman realizing in real time that the one person who had spent decades excusing her methods had finally stopped. She recovered quickly, the way I imagined she'd recovered from 1,000 smaller cracks before. But that moment, brief as it was the first entirely unguarded thing I'd seen from her all night. And I understood then that whatever came next for her marriage, that sentence of Richard's had already changed something that wasn't going back to how it was. There it was, the one final mistake, delivered entirely by her own words, needing no push from me at all. She had just told the entire room, in front of her own husband and son, that she believed love and belonging were things you could edit out of a family for the sake of a picture. Priscilla Boudreau, the wedding planner, who had been standing quietly near the doorway through the whole exchange, stepped forward at that point and said, in a voice that clearly cost her something to use, "For what it's worth, Mrs. Ashford Kane asked me directly to remove Mr. Grissom's name from 3 separate versions of the seating chart over the past 4 months, and told me specifically not to mention his exclusion to Emily unless asked. I have those emails if anyone needs them." That was the moment the room's verdict became official. Not from me, not from Daniel, but from the one person present who had nothing personally at stake either way, and had simply been asked, directly, to confirm a fact. Sometimes the truth needs to be witnessed by somebody with nothing to gain from either side before people are willing to fully believe it. Priscilla's quiet, professional confirmation did more in 10 seconds than an hour of my own arguing could have. I did not gloat. I want you to understand that clearly. There was no part of me, even in that moment of complete vindication, that felt like celebrating. Emily stood up from the table and came around to where I was standing, and she put both arms around my neck the way she used to when she was small enough for me to pick her up off the ground, and she cried into my shoulder in front of that entire room of people in a way I know embarrassed her later, and I know she needed anyway. "I'm so sorry, Daddy," she said, and it had been years since she called me that instead of Dad. "I should have called you. I should have asked you directly instead of believing a voicemail I never even fully listened to twice." "You believed the people around you," I told her, quiet enough that it was just for her. "That's not a character flaw, honey. That's just what trust does when somebody uses it against you. This isn't on you." I left the Bayou Club about 20 minutes later, before dessert was served, because I could feel that my presence for the rest of the night would only turn a family's rehearsal dinner into a longer referendum on Vivian Ashford Kane, and that wasn't what I'd come there to do. I'd come to make sure my daughter knew the truth. She knew it now. What the family did with that truth going forward wasn't mine to manage. I drove home with the windows down, the July night finally cooling into something almost pleasant, and I did not feel triumphant. I felt tired in a way that went all the way down to the bone. The specific tired that comes after carrying something heavy for a long time and finally setting it down. When I got home, I sat on the porch for a long while, not doing anything, not thinking anything in particular, just sitting there in the dark with the crickets going and the shape of the 12 acres barely visible against the sky. What I felt, more than victory, was a strange kind of grief. Grief for the version of Vivian who might have existed if somebody, somewhere in her own life, had ever taught her that image and love weren't supposed to be the same currency. Grief, too, For the 4 months my daughter had spent believing her own father had abandoned her for a check. For months I could never fully get back, no matter how completely the truth had come out that night. Underneath all of it, though, quiet and steady, was something like relief. The specific relief of a man who did not have to raise his voice a single time to be believed. I thought, too, about my own father that night, sitting alone in the dark on my porch, in a way I hadn't expected to. I thought about how easy it would have been, 29 years earlier, for me to become a man who solved hurt with volume, the way he so often had. I thought about the promise I'd made to myself in that VA hospital room, and I realized, sitting there with the crickets going, that I had actually managed to keep it, all the way through the hardest test it had ever been given. That realization didn't erase the hurt of the previous month, but it sat next to the hurt comfortably enough that I finally slept that night better than I had in weeks. The wedding, in the end, went forward 6 days later, though it looked very different from the version Vivian had spent 18 months architecting. Vivian did not attend. That was Richard's decision as much as anyone's, made quietly in the days between the rehearsal dinner and the ceremony itself, and I understand it caused a rift between them that, as far as I know, has not fully healed even now. I walked my daughter down the aisle myself, in a small outdoor ceremony that had been hastily reorganized at a much simpler venue after the original one's non-refundable deposit went, ironically, to waste. Emily wore her mother's wedding dress, altered slightly, instead of the designer gown Vivian had commissioned. It suited her better anyway. Priscilla Boudreau, to her credit, finished out the wedding planning pro bono, telling Emily quietly that it was the least she could do after staying silent as long as she had. I gave a toast, the one Vivian had once suggested I get coaching for, and I did not need coaching. I talked about the sticky notes on the dashboard. I talked about Carol, who would have loved Daniel, and who would have had far less patience for Vivian than I'd managed to have. I did not mention the check, the letter, or the 6 days I'd spent thinking my daughter had chosen $12,000 worth of distance over her own father. That story belonged to a different night, and it had already been told to the people who needed to hear it. As for what happened to Vivian Ashford Kane afterward, I'll tell you plainly, without any satisfaction in the telling, because that's not the kind of man I want to be even now. The story of the forged signature and the attempted payoff made its way, as these things eventually do in a city with a society page, through enough of Houston's charity board circuit that Vivian quietly stepped down from 2 of her 3 board positions within 4 months. Richard filed for a legal separation the following spring, and the last I heard through Daniel, Vivian had moved into a condo downtown and was, according to her son, working on herself, whatever that ends up meaning in practice. I don't know if she's changed. I hope, honestly, that some part of her has, because carrying around the belief that love is a negotiable line item is its own kind of prison, and nobody deserves to live in that one forever, not even the people who try to lock you in it. 1 year later, life on my 12 acres looks mostly the way it always has, with a few good additions. Emily and Daniel bought a modest house about 25 minutes from me instead of the sprawling place in River Oaks Vivian had originally pushed them toward. And Daniel, much to his own mother's old horror, I imagine, has taken up learning basic home repair from me on weekends. Badly at first, better now. Calluses slowly forming on hands that used to be as soft as his mother's opinions of me once implied mine weren't good enough. Emily still calls every Sunday at 6 o'clock, sitting on the same tailgate whenever she visits, though these days there's sometimes a second voice on the call too. Since she's 5 months pregnant with a daughter, she's already decided will call me Pop-Pop, over my mild objections that it makes me sound older than I feel. The new bathtub finally got installed in the master bathroom this spring, the one Carol asked for years before she died, and I never got around to finishing before she passed. White simple, nothing fancy. I stood in the doorway one morning not long ago with a cup of coffee, looking at it, thinking about how something so small, a bathtub, a folded letter, a cashier's check, can end up splitting your whole understanding of a year wide open, and how the same small thing, months later, can just as quietly become part of an ordinary, peaceful life again. I still have that cashier's check, by the way, uncashed, sitting in the same safe deposit box where Ray suggested I keep it in the first place. Emily asked me once, not long after the wedding, why I never tore it up or sent it back, and I told her the truth, that I wanted to keep it exactly as it was, not out of spite, but as a reminder to myself of how close I came to letting a piece of paper convince me I'd lost something I hadn't actually lost at all. Some nights, when I'm looking for the folder with the truck's title or the deed to the land, I see the corner of that check sticking out from behind the other papers, and I think about how differently this whole year could have gone if I'd let anger make my decisions instead of patience. Daniel and I go fishing most Saturday mornings now, out on a little pontoon properties over that a neighbor lets us use, and he's gotten decent enough, with a rod, that I don't have to rebait his hook every 10 minutes anymore, which I consider real progress. He asked me, the very first time we went out there, whether I minded him coming around so much given everything his mother had done, and I told him the truth, that I'd spent a long time deciding whether to hold a son responsible for his mother's choices, and I'd landed on no, provided he kept showing up honestly, which so far, a year running, he always has. He told me once, sitting out there in the quiet with the bobbers barely moving, that those Saturday mornings had done more to teach him what a father was supposed to look like than anything he'd absorbed growing up in his own house, and I didn't know what to say to that except to hand him another worm and tell him to quit jerking the line so hard. Priscilla Boudreau still sends Emily a Christmas card every year, and last spring she referred us, meaning me, of all people, to a young couple she was planning a wedding for who wanted someone who actually knows how to build things, to construct a rustic arch for their outdoor ceremony. I built it out of cedar over 2 weekends in my shop, and standing at that wedding watching 2 strangers get married under something I'd made with my own hands felt like its own quiet kind of resolution, one I hadn't expected and wasn't looking for. If there's one truth this whole year revealed to me, it's this. Love that asks you to erase yourself for someone else's comfort was never love to begin with. It was management. It was image control wearing love's clothes. Real love doesn't need you to disappear to make the picture look better. If anything asks that of you, a partner, a parent, a future in-law, anyone, the thing being protected in that moment is never actually the relationship. It's somebody's comfort, dressed up to look like care. I've turned that idea over a lot this past year, trying to understand exactly why it took me so long to name it clearly even after I already had the proof sitting on my kitchen table. I think it's because erasure rarely announces itself directly. Nobody sits you down and says, I've decided you don't belong in this picture anymore. It arrives instead as a seating chart that quietly leaves your name off. A comment about wardrobe, framed as generosity. A phone call you never made, attributed to you anyway, because it's easier for everyone if the story sounds like your own choice rather than somebody else's decision made on your behalf. By the time you notice the pattern, you've usually already forgiven 3 or 4 smaller versions of it, each one small enough on its own to seem like nothing. That's the part one most want people to hear, because I think it's the part that keeps good, reasonable people trapped in these situations far longer than they should be. You don't miss the moment you got erased, because it doesn't look like erasure while it's happening. It looks like reasonableness. It looks like somebody being thoughtful about details. It looks, very often, like exactly the kind of person everybody around you insists is only trying to help. I want to speak directly to some of you watching this tonight, because I know this story landed somewhere specific for more than a few of you. If you're a parent right now who's being quietly written out of your own child's life by somebody who's decided you don't fit the picture they're building, you are not imagining it, and you are not the problem, no matter how reasonable the explanation sounds when it's delivered in a calm, expensive voice. If you're an adult child who's ever believed a second-hand story about a parent instead of picking up the phone and asking them directly, please, this week, pick up that phone. The 5 minutes of an honest conversation is almost always cheaper than the months of hurt built on somebody else's version of events. If you're the one currently carrying an entire family's finances, decisions, and emotional weather on your own shoulders, while everyone else simply enjoys the calm you're manufacturing for them, I see you, and I want you to know that the exhaustion you're feeling is not weakness. It's the cost of being the only adult in a room full of people who've never had to learn how to be one. If you're currently in the middle of the hard part of a story like this one, the part where you know something is wrong, but you don't yet have the proof to say so out loud, and every day feels like carrying a weight nobody else can see, I want you to know that the waiting is not wasted time. Every quiet week I spent gathering the truth instead of reacting to my hurt was a weak that made the eventual truth impossible to argue with. Slow does not mean weak. Slow, done carefully, is often the only thing strong enough to hold up once it finally gets said out loud. And if you've ever done the difficult work of loving someone well for years, only to watch a single well-told lie undo, in a few months, what took you a decade to build, I want you to understand that the lie's success was never a measurement of your love's worth. It only ever measured how good the liar was at lying, and how much access to your loved one's ear they'd managed to secure. Those two things say everything about the person telling the story, and nothing at all about you. And if you loved somebody correctly, showed up for them for years, did the work, kept the calls, kept the promises, and they still let someone else convince them you didn't matter, I want you to hear this clearly. You loved correctly. They acted incorrectly. Those are two completely different things, and only one of them is actually a reflection of who you are. Here is one practical thing I'd ask you to do this week. If any part of this story felt uncomfortably familiar, if there's a document anywhere with your name or your signature on it that you didn't personally review line by line, a venue contract, a power of attorney, a joint account, anything, go find it and read every word yourself. Not the summary somebody gave you, the actual document. If anything on that page surprises you, you are allowed to ask hard questions before you sign or agree to anything else, and you are allowed to bring in your own lawyer to look at it if your gut tells you to. Being careful with your own name is not paranoia. It's simply staying awake in your own life. And here's the question I'd leave you with tonight. Somewhere in your life right now, is there a version of you being quietly edited out of a picture to make someone else more comfortable? And if there is, how much longer exactly? Do you plan to let that editing happen without once asking who's really holding the scissors? Sit with that question this week longer than feels comfortable. The honest answer usually takes a few extra days to surface, and it's almost always worth the wait. If this story meant something to you, here's what I'd ask. Drop a 1 in the comments if you believe I did the right thing showing up at that rehearsal dinner with the folder instead of confronting Vivian the night the check arrived. Drop a 2 if part of you still feels for Vivian, understanding that people who control others often learned it from being controlled themselves. Drop a 3 if this story touched something real and specific in your own life. A parent pushed aside, a truth you found out too late, or too early, to change anything. And before you go, tell me where you're watching this from, and what time it is there right now. Somebody out there is going to watch this at 2 in the morning, unable to sleep, from somewhere I would never expect, and somehow this will end up being exactly the story they needed to hear tonight. That happens more often than you'd think, and it means something to me every single time I read those comments. If any part of tonight's video felt like your own life, I hope you'll stick around. This isn't a channel built for entertainment. It's built for people who've been through something real and are looking for a little proof. Once in a while, that dignity still wins more often than we're told it does. I read the comments myself, most nights, sitting in the same chair on the same porch where a good chunk of the story actually happened. And I mean that literally rather than as some kind of line I say for effect. If you've got a story of your own, even just a sentence of it, I'd like to hear it. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences, fully rewritten and reimagined here in the Houston, Texas area to create original content for this channel. Any resemblance to real people, families, or events is entirely coincidental. If anything in this story matched your own life a little too closely, please consider reaching out to a licensed attorney, a family counselor, or your local adult protective services if you feel unsafe or unheard. You are not alone in this. And remember, sometimes the truth doesn't arrive with a crash or a shout. Sometimes it's just a quiet sound you finally stop ignoring. Pay attention this week. Stay kind to the people who've earned it. And stay awake.